If you are not familiar with the term tradwife, it is a woman who chooses to live a more traditional life with ultra-traditional gender roles. So the man goes outside the house, works, provides for the family. The woman stays home, and she's the homemaker. She takes care of the home and the children if there are any.
And men are fetishizing her. It's that one thing of like traditional women who are nurturing, stay at home. She's got like the whole, blouse and robe on, and she's got the little bonnet and everything.
That's cute.
And guys are fucking going crazy for it because it's like, dude, this is what we want, and we're not getting that. And women are not understanding this. Hey, we should go back to these times because it's a good thing.
So, tradwives have become the source of fierce debate and profits online for a while now. People who criticize the trend have pointed out how silly it looks and that it glorifies a time where women faced major inequality, and that it's sort of setting back all the progress that we've made in terms of women's rights and independence. On the other hand, supporters argue that being a tradwife leads to more happiness, stability, and fulfillment, pointing to studies claiming that women were happier in the past with fewer mental health struggles, among other things. And I think this raises an interesting question. If tradwives today are happier, and if women in the past were too, then should we consider going back to that way of life? Is that better because people were happier back then? Many people find it hard to believe that a tradwife could genuinely be happy, leading them to spend a considerable effort trying to debunk tradwife influencers as secretly unhappy or somehow trapped in their situation. And this skepticism isn't surprising. It's a valid question to ask why someone would choose to be a full-time, subservient homemaker. Tradwife content is often critiqued through the lens of undervalued or forced labor. Take the example of Ballerina Farm, where the former Juilliard-trained dancer becomes a housewife, competing in beauty pageants just weeks after giving birth. For her birthday, she received an egg apron from her billionaire husband, and she was hoping for a trip to Venice, I think. And personally, I think this is objectively unfair. I wouldn't accept it myself, and I don't think she should have either. Historically, women's labor has been entirely undervalued and taken for granted, explained as women just naturally wanting to be self-sacrificing, needing nothing in return, that we're happier if we give up our lives for some kids or an ungrateful husband. Running a home, though, is undeniably hard work, and it's often far from the idealized version that creators present online. However, despite all of this, one could interpret it as a Sisyphean paradox. In Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus, the absurdist philosopher suggests that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, despite his endless toil and futile labor of pushing a boulder up a hill for it just to roll down again afterwards. And similarly, I think we can imagine that tradwives could be happy, even if their chosen path seems to be counterintuitive to modern notions of freedom, equality, and in general, a nice life. If tradwives find happiness in a life that appears restrictive and incredibly hard, we could dismiss it as them simply being crazy or manipulated in some way, or we could recognize it as valid, knowing that there's a variable way that people wish to live their lives and find happiness in it. Secondly, I'd argue that if you look at all the options, it isn't that weird to imagine a tradwife happy. In many ways, this whole trend just reeks of people wanting to escape capitalist exploitation, and thus wander into a fantasy of domestic bliss that, more often than not, is simply just that. A fantasy funded by an immense trust fund or a lucrative influencer career. The tradwife era has given rise to memes like the exhausted girl boss who longs for domesticity over the grind of capitalism. An understandable sentiment because rejecting the exploitative demands of capitalism is a very valid wish. I've discussed this before in my video, Loving Your Job is a Mental Illness. However, there's a fallacy in comparing one form of oppression to another. Both situations impose different kinds of constraints, and it's crucial to recognize that opting out of one system of oppression doesn't necessarily free you from all forms of domination or control. Traditional domestic roles come with their own set of limitations and power dynamics. The romanticized image of a tradwife often glosses over the historical realities of women's subjugation within the home, where economic dependence on a husband and lack of opportunities outside the domestic sphere often led to a kind of oppression that was just as real, if not as visible, as the pressures of the modern workplace. Which is why during this influencer tradwife era, we've also seen ex-tradwives using their platforms to warn younger women who romanticize a man being their oppressor or the person in control of their lives of the very real consequences that can occur if that man somehow turns out not to be trustworthy.
I want to start this video by saying that I'm not asking for money and I'm not asking for sympathy. What I'm asking for is, if you are a young 14, 16, 21-year-old girl, listen up. I drove to the grocery store. I need to grab some milk and bread and a couple things, flipped open the Pink app on my phone, and I've been sitting in my car crying ever since because I never have enough money. And why do I never have enough money? Because when I was a 19-year-old girl, I fell in love. My Mormon faith told me that I was supposed to be a stay-at-home mom. I got married. I started having babies. I dropped out of college. I never had a career. My only jobs that I ever had in life were a waitress at the Olive Garden and managing a pretzel maker in a mall. Oh, my first couple years of marriage, I decided that I wanted to be an entrepreneur, so I bought a windshield business. I was 20. And my Mormon stake president reminded me that women weren't supposed to work, so I quit my own business, handed it over to my husband, took my name off of it. I would work our family business throughout the next 24 years of my marriage, but I never got paid. I didn't have a salary. My name wasn't on it. I literally worked for room and board. That's it.
Now, we will never know if all these tradwives are held captive or not, but for the sake of argument, we shall accept that it's done of free will. And if tradwives are happy, their contentment must be acknowledged and respected. Personal happiness is a deeply subjective experience, and for those who find fulfillment in traditional roles and have the funds to do it, this lifestyle may indeed bring a lot of joy and satisfaction, and I don't think we should tear that down just because it reminds you of something oppressive. At the same time, the happiness dilemma becomes everyone's issue when one draws the conclusion that because some tradwives are happy, and because research suggests that women were happier in the past, this means that society was better back then. And if society was better back then, that means that we should return to how things were, because feminism has clearly just made us all free and depressed. This perspective is the sort of standard conclusion that's drawn by, I think, a lot of conservative commentators. And it's a really compelling argument, I think. It's one that Žižek uses a lot and that I would argue for as well. That there might be a downside to liberalism or freedom, and that the modern obsession with choice and individual freedom can become a kind of tyranny itself. That by emphasizing freedom as the ultimate good, society may inadvertently create conditions that lead to greater anxiety, insecurity, and dissatisfaction. Žižek points out that in the name of freedom, people are often forced into relentless pursuits of self-optimization and self-fulfillment, which can be exhausting and alienating. The demand to be constantly choosing, constantly shaping one's own life according to an ever-expanding array of options can be, and often is, a source of stress, rather than any real felt liberation. And in this view, we can imagine that the traditional roles, despite their limitations, and probably because of their limitations, offered a kind of relief from a constant pressure to define and redefine oneself. The predefined roles of the past, while restrictive, provided a sense of identity and purpose that many people lack today. Moreover, Žižek argues that the idea of freedom in a liberal society is often illusory. While individuals are ostensibly free to make their own choices, these choices are heavily shaped by ideological structures and social expectations that are not always visible. In this sense, the freedom offered by liberalism can be a form of subtle coercion, where individuals are free to conform to social norms and market-driven definitions of success and happiness, ultimately not really making us free at all. And I very much agree with this. I see how one could easily argue that constructing a world where people are ostensibly less happy by discouraging traditional roles goes against common sense. If tradwives claim to find happiness in these roles, why should society challenge them? Why did we ever challenge them? Are conservatives right in naming feminism a net negative in that sense? And I think answering this lies in understanding why the principles of freedom can't simply follow what would make people the happiest. Kant famously argued that happiness, while a natural and universal desire, shouldn't be the ultimate goal of human action. Happiness is contingent and subjective, varying greatly from person to person, depending on their own desires, inclinations, or circumstances. And because of its inherent variability, happiness can't serve as a stable foundation for moral decision-making or societal organization, because we simply wouldn't be able to make a system that would work for everyone if we're going off of happiness as the main source. One of the more significant implications of Kant's philosophy is that the principle of freedom, understood as autonomy and adherence to moral duty, should take precedence over the pursuit of happiness or satisfaction. This means that constructing a world where people have the freedom to choose their roles, even if it leads to less overall happiness, is more ethically sound than constructing a world where happiness is maximized at the expense of autonomy. And in the context of tradwives, while their happiness is important, it should not be the sole criterion for determining the values of their roles. Society has a responsibility to ensure that individuals are making choices based on reason and autonomy, not just on what makes them happy. And this might involve questioning and challenging traditional roles to ensure that they are truly chosen freely, rather than accepted uncritically because they offer a path to happiness that avoids the complexities of modern life, for example. So even if a tradwife, or say a well-treated slave, finds happiness in their roles or their lives, this doesn't negate or make up for the fundamental lack of freedom in their lives. Moments of joy do not make restrictive roles acceptable, as they still limit inherently autonomy and potential. Society's role isn't to maximize happiness at all cost, but to ensure that people have the freedom to choose that path themselves. So, should we roll back the clock and return to a world where women were mostly homemakers simply because they might have been happier then? From a Kantian perspective, at least, the answer is a firm no. Happiness, while important, is never the ultimate measure of a good life. Kant's philosophy is clear. Personal autonomy, the ability to make free, rational choices, is the foundation of human dignity, not fleeting happiness. Women didn't fight for the right to vote, work, divorce, and control their own lives because they were promised or guaranteed happiness, but because it promised freedom. The real issue, then, isn't whether the tradwife lifestyle makes women happier. It's whether or not the lifestyle allows for genuine choice. If we start pushing people into roles for the sake of comfort or simplicity, without questioning if they truly had the freedom to choose, we're on shaky ethical grounds. Imposing any kind of lifestyle on anyone, even one that might bring happiness, violates the very core of autonomy. Kant would argue that ethical decision-making isn't about maximizing happiness. It's about respecting freedom. If women are simply slipping into traditional roles because it's easier or less complicated without deep reflection, then they're simply missing the point. Even if some women find happiness going back to these roles, it's still ethically flawed if they can't freely choose to work, stay single, or have their husbands be the homemaker. A society that limits these choices isn't just old-fashioned, it's inherently unjust. And while Žižek might say modern society is full of fake freedoms, Kant would probably respond that the real problem isn't the existence of societal norms, but the failure to root freedom in reason and moral duty. Real freedom in Kant's eyes doesn't come from tearing down structures or conforming to societal pressures. It comes from rational self-governance and the ability to make decisions based on universal principles. And that's the kind of autonomy that's worth fighting for, whether in the home, the workplace, or anywhere else for that matter. Yeah.